first three parts were about CGO methods, complex geometrical object solutions, etc., and somehow trying to solve the problem in a rigorous way. So now we turn to the Calderon problem with partial data. And the first one, let me first state the problem so that we're sure what this is all about. So I know from last week you already saw from Lacasse something about this, but anyway, there may be some repetition here. So the basic idea now is that we still look for some convexity distribution about a domain in 2 or higher dimensions. We are now allowed to access the boundary, but only through certain regions, subsets of the boundary. So this is illustrated in this picture here. So there's one part of the boundary I call this gamma 1, and this is where we have the support of the derivative data that we specified. And then there's another part of the boundary called this gamma 2. This is where we measure the Neumann data. And this sets up for us. So of course, whenever we specify a voltage here, there's still a unique solution to this problem, and it gives rise to a current, nominal current flow through the boundary. And then we take we only measure this part on gamma 2. So this is the setup for the Calderon problem with the partial data. And the partial data Dirichlet-Neumann map is now this one that takes F supported on gamma 1 to G supported on gamma 2. So a little bit later, this lambda gamma here will be the Neumann to Dirichlet map. Of course, you can state the opposite problem as well without any difficulties. Right. So just a little bit about the story, rather short story. So there are many other papers than what I list here, but what I emphasize on is the papers that have the CGO solutions as a central component in the analysis. So maybe I should say first of all, there was a paper by Kohn and Vogelius who actually showed that if gamma 1 and gamma 2 they are small, possibly very small subsets on the boundary, they are equal, then we can recover a piecewise real analytic function. And this, as we heard already in talks previously, there's some analytic consideration that comes into play here. So knowing only a very small subset is enough. But this is a very special class of functions. So then there was a pretty nice paper by Bogame and Ullmann where they showed that if you take, say, gamma 1 to be essentially the entire boundary, and then gamma 2 only half of the boundary, then that suffices for uniqueness. And let me just mention how that setup is done. So the basic idea is the following. So suppose we have some domain for ease, I draw it as a circular domain. Then what we do is that we pick some vector called this C, and then the choice of this vector here divides the boundary into 2 sets. One set that sits down here, where this here is C dot mu is less than 0, and one part up here, C dot mu greater than 0. So this is this part and that part. So and the basic idea is that suppose we can now put different condition everywhere, and then measure Neumann conditions only on such a part here, slightly more than, has to be slightly larger, but anyway. Then that suffices for uniqueness for the inverse problem. So what they did was to use so-called Kalman estimates. And the basic idea with this Kalman estimate, so there'll be more about Kalman estimates in the afternoon by Lacasse. But the basic idea, the way it comes in here, why it's useful, is because the information, so if you only measure Neumann data down here, you'd like to know something about what happens up here as well. But the Kalman estimate allows you to estimate the Neumann data on this part of the boundary. And in some limit, you can then forget about whatever happens up here because it vanishes. So this is where the Kalman estimate comes in handy in this approach here. This was the first time actually these Kalman estimates, I think, appeared in for this Calderon problem. But maybe you can you'll say more about it later. Somehow this already is so the solutions they use are still the CGO solutions. for this here. And what they suppress is then the CDO solution, normal derivative of those in this part of the boundary, essentially. So the solutions are the same as the ones that we've seen previously. But this idea of having Kalman estimates and use those were then elaborated on in this also very nice paper by Kenny, Scherz, and Ullmann that was already mentioned also by Winky yesterday. So what they show, what they show is that if we take just a very small portion of the boundary as for our Dirichlet data, and then what we have to do is that we measure Neumann data on the remaining part of the boundary, then that suffices for uniqueness. And that comes about if one makes a drawing in a similar way. So the basic idea is that you fix a point now out here, and then what you look at is then this part of the boundary. That being the gamma 1, this part of the boundary. So if you move this point here closer to the boundary, of course gamma 1 will then be smaller and smaller. And this is where this arbitrary small subset comes in. But the price is, again, that we have to measure Neumann data everywhere else on the boundary. So in this sense, these results are not really local results, because you need to have access to both sides of the boundary.
So you need to correct that. I think gamma 2 contains that, right?
So that,
because you want gamma 2 to be big.
Right. So this is the wrong way. Yes. Right. Thank you. Yeah. So then there are further results. There was a result by Isakov where there were some special requirements on the geometry of the subsets. So these were actually full local results. And then let me point out also a stability estimate by Hagen 1. We already talked a little bit about stability estimates for the Caloran problem, and they're of log type. So you not expect very good reconstructions. But if you start to look at the stability estimate for this case here, they are of log type. And this alpha here is a positive number. So they are worse, they're logarithmically more worse than the previous ones. So this is more unstable. Right. So we have already an unstable problem, and we have now something which is much more unstable. So the less information, the more unstable the problem gets, even though you have uniqueness and so on. So I should say in 2D as well, so the problem was a little bit later, more or less completely solved in 2D. So for arbitrary small subsets, gamma 1 and gamma 2, that coincide, by Ivanovich, Ullmann, and Yamamoto, again using Kalman estimates techniques. I think there have been improvement here. So this was for the Dirichlet map. It was a recent paper where you used the considered Neumann to Dirichlet operator instead. So the situation is still that the 3D problem was considered first, like in the full data case, but the 2D problem was completely solved before the 3D problem. So there's still an open problem here, whether arbitrary small subset gives enough information in order to retrieve the conductivity distribution. Right.
But the corresponding case of 2D for 3D or 3D and higher is not done, right? Wherein you make F and Neumann on the same.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Yes.
But what's the primary difficulty?
So I think it's mainly technical. So you don't have the estimates, really.
And here the technique of Buchheim will work. Is that why it is?
This down here?
Yeah.
No, so the Buchheim estimate here is essentially the same as the one here. It's just the weight functions are different in the Kalman estimate.
Yeah, but I'm referring to the paper.
Down here?
Yeah,
yes.
But there was a paper using stationary phase.
Right. Yes. So I'm not completely into the details of this construction down here. In order to discuss this, I know better the stuff up here.
But the difficulty is mainly technique.
I think so. Yes. So there's no reason to believe that it should not work in 3D as well. I don't see any reason to believe that actually. So, okay.
Yes. What also stability estimates in the 2D case?
So is there a stability estimate in 2D? I did not look for it. I'm not aware of it. So that's a good question. Maybe someone else knows about it. I don't know. So the typical situation is that you first have a uniqueness result, and then working hard on this result, following constants and so on, you get the stability estimate. So from that point of view, I would expect that sooner or later, following the approach here, one should come up with a stability estimate. So that's but I have not seen a paper on this. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. Right. So a lot is known about this partial data problem so far, but let me just step one step back and discuss a little bit more Tikhonov regularization, because this is actually the approach we'll take soon to this problem. So from the list of references here, there was not any reconstruction algorithm really. So there is one paper, I should maybe have mentioned, by Brown, by Nachman and Brian Street, where they actually come up with a reconstruction algorithm. But whether that's can be implemented numerically in the 3D problem is not so clear, I would say. But the approach we took in a project was instead to look at an optimization problem, formulate the image problem as an optimization problem. And let's just revisit such an optimization problem. So it's very typical whenever you have an image problem, kx equals to y. This k could be linear or non-linear as well. To look for some function to optimize, some objective function. So in this context here, there would be a discrepancy term. So how good does this x that we may think is the solution, how well does it fit the data? That's the first thing. And then the next thing is there's some penalty put on the x in order for the noise in the problem not to blow up everything. I don't know if you saw, maybe you saw examples last week or maybe this week. Peter Kutschman also has some stuff related to this. Bastian has some stuff related to this as well. So this term here has to do with, you can think about having to do with the noise, model of the noise. So actually, if kx minus y here would be an estimate of the noise in the problem. Whereas this here has to do with what do we know about the solution we're looking for already. So we're looking for some particular x, and we say, okay, we want to penalize some features in this x. So this is in one sense, this specifies what kind of solutions do we like to have. And there are many choices of norm that one could choose, and it's all being done all the time. So the typical would be to have this penalty term as a L2 squared norm, like this here, and then we're in the framework of the usual Tikhonov formulation. You have the same Hilbert space here and there, and the approach that Bastian was talking about, applying the k star to this equation here, adding the alpha times identity to the problem and then doing inversion, that will solve the problem immediately. So this is pretty well understood. But there are other choices. So one could be to, let's just say we think that the solution we're looking for is more smooth than just L2. So then why not take a gradient of x and then penalize this term here. Then there will be some subgroup space regularization. Essentially, depending on the space distance, will be an H1 norm on the functions, and then you would penalize solutions that have large H1 norm. That's another choice. So both of these choices here, they fancy smooth solutions. This is something that here one typically sees, that whatever comes out of such here is smooth. This will be more smooth than that one. But there are other choices, and very popular in these days is total variation, which I think comes from image analysis mainly. So you look for gradient of x, but then you take the L1 norm of that. So this total variation regularization fancies something which is piecewise constant. So if you think about images where you have big regions that are where it has the same color, then this is a nice prior to put in whenever you do denoising and so on. Because then you get nice regions where of constant value. And then there's a fourth one I put here, is what people call sparsity regularization. So And this is nothing, this right here is nothing but the L1 norm. And what does that have to do with sparsity, one could ask. So maybe just make a small drawing here. So typically when you talk about sparsity, you think about this here as a matrix, say n by n matrix, x would be an n vector, and y would be an n vector. So when you talk about sparsity, you want to have as few of these coefficients in this vector here that are non-zero, to have as many zeros as possible. This is the basic idea when it comes to sparsity. So if one makes a little drawing here, so if it's just in 2D, and then equation AX equal to y would be something like, maybe I should draw it actually more like this here. So that would be some line in space. So if we do the L2 regularization, it reflects the fact that we take a ball like this one here, and if instead of thinking this as a penalty term, think of this as a constraint, we have to think about it is that we would like to have the x having some bound in the L2 norm that is as close as possible to our equation line up here. And that will probably be something like this point here. Right. So this reflects the penalty term, this reflects the discrepancy term of the equation. So if you do the L1 instead, then the ball in L1 looks something like this. This is the unit ball, or the ball of some radius in the one norm. And if you think about which of these points here sitting on the surface here is closest to this line, then it turns out that it's sitting somewhere here. This is L2 penalty. And this is L1 penalty for this here and here. So if you compare the sparsity of these two solutions, it looks like this one here is less sparse. So here both numbers are non-zero. Here one is 0 and one is non-zero. So this is the typical drawing people make when they talk about the sparsity, that you get something which is sparse. Of course, when you go to higher dimensions, so in Rn, it looks different, but the same idea, I think, can be applied. But even if you go to nonlinear problems, it's maybe not so easy to see what's actually going on. But anyway, in our approach to this problem, what we have looked at is the following. So the basic idea is to take the sigma that we're looking for, write that as something known plus a perturbation. And then the basic assumption that underlies everything here is that this perturbation is sparse in some representation. So not necessarily the canonical basis in Rn, but it could be in some orthonormal basis of, let's say, a Hilbert space. Okay. So we now move to the infinite dimensional setting, and then we have orthonormal basis for our Hilbert space. So what does it mean to be sparse? It means that if we do an expansion of delta sigma in this basis, with these coefficients, then there's only few numbers that are different from 0. So all the information about the delta sigma are carried in a few of the coefficients. So this is what is meant by sparsity in this context here. So what we do in the following is where we take k measurements of Dirichlet and Neumann data here, where gk is, so this gk should not be here. If k is lambda sigma gk, and this is now the Neumann to Dirichlet map. Just not I hope it doesn't confuse too much. So we look at a functional, this is the one given here. So a functional on delta sigma. Remember, sigma was of this form here. We know that sigma is 0. We're looking for the delta sigma. It consists of two terms. So one is the data fidelity term, one is the penalty term. So this R term that comes here is quite simple. So it takes our measurements fk and gk, and what we evaluate is for some delta sigma that we could put into the problem, we solve the forward problem given the gk, and compare that to the FK that we measured. So that's the way this looks. I believe there should be a square here. Just down here. So this is just the L2 norm on the boundary of where we actually do the measurement. So in this problem, I maybe should have mentioned more clearly, the idea is to take the partial boundary measurements on the same subsets, but I mean, you could do anything here. It's actually quite flexible, this approach. So this is comparing the measurements to what we would obtain if it was delta sigma that was our candidate. And then there's the penalty term over here. So we penalize the delta sigma, the sparsity of the delta sigma. So what we do, we compute the coefficients. Right here, these are the CJs from before, and we sum those and we weigh them with some alpha J. So the more non-zeros we have here, the greater this one will be. But of course, what one could say from this expression here, having many small CJs would be as good as having few large in this norm here. But it turns out that what comes out are also, as you'll see in the algorithm soon, small frequencies are removed when you solve this optimization problem. Small coefficients are removed. So there's a note here about this alpha j. So typically in the signal regularization, this alpha j would be sitting outside here. So we're sitting outside here, right? It would be a uniform alpha for the entire penalty term. So here this alpha is embedded into this series. And what this actually means is that we could, from prior knowledge, favor some of the basis functions. Say we know that this and this and that, these three basis functions, we know that they should contain information. So we will not penalize if the algorithm picks out coefficients in those directions. But in other directions, the algorithm work. So by choosing this alpha here, we could favor some basis functions instead of other. Okay. And this is a way of enforcing prior information into the problem. This will be useful later, as you'll see. All right. So what is the method for solving such an optimization problem? The method we use is something called conditional gradient method with soft thresholding. Some of you may be familiar with this soft thresholding, and we'll get to that later. So here's a blank image. So some of you may be classified to see the picture on the front. I'm sorry, this is too very bad. Anyway, so the basic idea when you talk about steepest descent method, and this is the class of steepest descent method, is to, in an iterative fashion, what you do is that you pick a direction which is in the direction of the negative gradient of whatever you are optimizing, and then you take one step in that direction in order to update your your delta sigma here. So this is what I was supposed to illustrate here, but on the screen looks better. Anyway, so the way this goes for the particular problem is that we compute a Freset derivative of this R, this penalty, not the penalty, but the misfit term at some current choice of delta sigma in some direction eta. And this can be basically computed by this function, which is denoted by nabla S R. So this is a function which sits in our space. This is a direction. This is the direction of the steepest descent. Well, actually steepest growth. This is the gradient direction. Okay. And this one, I will not really go into details, but because we did already some calculations on that on Wednesday. But this can be computed by solving forward problems. So whenever we have a candidate delta sigma, we have these K boundary measurements. We feed them into the forward solver, and then get that out, and then do something to the output, take gradients, products of gradients, and that's more or less what this is. Okay. So the basic iterative soft thresholding algorithm does the following in each step. So we consider now this linearized problem. There is a current delta sigma. This is delta sigma I. This is our current choice of delta sigma, and we'd like to find the next one. This is the iteration process that comes in. So the basic idea is to start with what we have. Okay, we do that. We take a negative gradient step. That's what comes in here. That was the gradient, and there's a step size here. So we take a step in the direction of the negative gradient, and then we ask for a delta sigma that fits whatever we have after taking this step. Right. So this is without any penalty. That would be somehow a linearized optimization scheme. That will be using non-regularized Newton, essentially. So there's some regularization that takes place also, and that comes in over here. So this is again the CJs. This is the alpha j. This is the regularization parameter, and this is added to our linearized functional. And now this is the functional that we are considering in each iteration. So we ask for the delta sigma that fits the forward step in the data pretty well, but has also not so much of this kind of norm as we have it over here. And then we minimize this with respect to delta, and that gives us what is called zeta I plus 1. So this may be sparse, or it may not be sparse, this zeta. But then we enforce a soft thresholding on this. So the zeta I plus 1, the one we found from minimizing up here, is now expanded into the phi j basis, coefficient dj, and then these we apply as a soft threshold operator, which is applied to the dj's, and that gives us the next delta sigma I plus 1. So maybe I should say what this soft thresholding actually does. The basic idea, which is actually written down here, right? So there's a function s beta t that takes up to the sine of t, it takes the maximum of t minus beta and 0 as output. So typically what we have is something like, so this will be the t that comes here. So here's the t, and here's then let's say y equal to t. So what you do in soft thresholding is that at some number beta here, and some number minus beta, you cut it off, whatever is in here. If you just cut it off and leave everything as it is, it will be what is called hard thresholding. And soft thresholding is where you cut it off, and then you move this part down here again. So it's something like this, and then over here it will be something like this. So it'll be a continuous function that looks like this. So all small coefficients that are inside this window of minus beta to beta, they are put to 0, and everything else is translated by this beta. Right. So this is the soft thresholding. Yes. So maybe one could ask, is this a difficult problem? Is this an easy problem to solve? It turns out this is a fairly easy problem to solve. So this is a linear operator that now comes in now fit. There's no nonlinearity here anymore. There's a nonlinearity, of course, over here, but so there's an easy algorithm to solve this optimization problem and then doing the soft thresholding afterwards. And this is done iteratively. So some choices on the numerics here. So what we did, we used a ball geometry again. So in 2D circle, 3D sphere for the measurement. So forward problems use solving finite element. Maybe some of you know about this Phoenix. Maybe not. So this is a pretty nice piece of software, freely available if you want to solve some PDEs numerically. Easy to use. So it's a company in Oslo where it came from, Simula, but now there are contributions from many different places around the world. So if you want to solve some kind of PDE problem at some instance in time, then you could start to look at this here. It's quite easy to use. The basis functions that we end up using are called phi j, and we use the Fem basis functions. So, and there's a reason for that. This is because everything, as when you use a finite element, is then output in terms of coefficients in this basis, essentially. So everything is represented already in the FEM basis. So it makes no sense to use those as building blocks. But there's of course something wrong here because I've said that this should be an orthonormal basis. And this is not an orthonormal basis. Because you know about finite elements, then you know that adjacent functions, they will actually overlap, and the inner product will not be 0. And there's a little price to pay, which I'll not go into, but one can do something to repair that. Right. But the nice thing, in addition to everything being represented in the FEM basis, is that these FEM functions, they are spatially well located. So some parts of the domain, you know exactly what FEM functions would have support there. Right? So, and that allows for the incorporation of some very intuitive prior information. And then I say here we use 10 number of measurements, so these are the Fourier basis functions simply. So I'll just show you some pictures of what actually gets in this approach here. So first of all, there's just a single perturbation here. Everything is 1, and the background is 1, and then there's a contrast of 6, and there's this rather big circular inclusion. And if we fit, I think here there was a uniform regularization parameters. The alpha j's are all equal, and the choice of alpha, this common alpha, is now the best possible. So this is what one obtains in this method here. So what is remarkable, I think, is the contrast. So in the other methods that we saw previously today, yesterday, the contrast was not very good. But here you actually do get very nice contrast. And I think you get pretty nice resolution as well. Then there's another phantom here, which is non-convex, slightly harder, actually a lot harder. There's a contrast of 4, and what you recover is then some convex hull, possibly of this one up here. But for this problem here, the contrast is not obtained very accurately. And then there's this phantom we looked at the other day, yesterday also. 0.5, this is 2, this is 0.5 in these regions here, and this is what you obtain, like this. In particular, in this picture here, we see that where the sparsity comes in. Because in the other, the CGO-based linearization, you would have something which was widely spread here. And also this one would come up, be widely spread. This is not what we see here. So this algorithm here enforces solutions that have sparse representations. Right? So this is, I think it's pretty evident here. And the contrast also here is pretty nice. So then there's the possibility of putting in prior information. So I promise you, the first day I will show some nice pictures eventually. I think this is maybe one of them. So what we did in this little study here was to say that, okay, let's assume we know something about where the location of this object is. So here we know nothing. So this was the solution from before. Over here what we have is, we have a circle that surrounds the object of interest, and this is, I think, 10% larger than actual support of this one here. So we're actually pretty well located. So what we say now to the algorithm is that you don't pay a price by picking information from here. You only pay a price by taking something out here. And therefore, it's of course clear that the algorithm would like to pick information inside, and it turns out that it picks pretty well, and you get the non-convex form of this kite pattern. Pretty nice. So what happens if you know exactly where the object is located? This is what we have here. So this is with exact support, and this is a very nice EIT picture, in my opinion. The problem is, of course, much simpler, right? Because we know we don't know what we look for. We know where it is, and we point exactly to that and find it here. So distribute values inside here so that it fits as good as possible with with the data. This is more or less it. Of course, the algorithm could pick something out here as well, but that would just be more expensive, right? So you get nice pictures if you know where it is. So this is the bottom line. Then one could ask, what if we took a wrong prior? So what if we assume something up here? I did not bring that picture. But then the typical situation is that you see then something up here, if this is what you give to the algorithm, but then still some wake shadows over here. That you may be able to tell from that you actually took a wrong prior information and fit to the problem.
It's with full data or partial?
This is with full data, yes. So the partial data comes exactly now. So this was not the phantom, but this was the full data reconstruction we had of the third phantom. So now if you only look for partial data on this part of the boundary here, so we put the reinforced Neumann data here and measure Dirichlet condition. This is the reconstruction we obtain. Again by so there's no prior information here, but there's a sparsity prior, if you put like that. The algorithm is the same, and this is how it looks like. So what is pretty clear here is that whatever is down here is almost impossible to see. But what is close to the boundary up here, the edges close to the boundary, where you actually do the measurements, it's pretty easy to see.
But the algorithm should change, isn't that right?
So the algorithm should change. So the only way it changes, let's see, I think it's better to look at this one here, is here. This gamma X here is where you compare your measurements to what comes out of the numerical algorithm, and then the G's have support on also that part of the boundary. So we don't use the cosines and sines from before, but we use some cosines and sines that are supported on let's say this at the part of the interval.
But would the Kalman weights change? The limiting Kalman weights change?
So
Take partial.
yes. So this is, I mean, we're not at all thinking about that in this approach. So there are no CGO solution to anything here. This is pure optimization. Right. So if we go to this picture here, so it's also clear that if we now measure the bottom half, we get information about this part of the inclusion, whereas getting some very blurred information about the other one comes out, but it's pretty hard to tell the localization of these two objects. So the lesson to learn from this here is that our intuition is correct in the sense that whatever is far from the boundary we measure is difficult to get, right? So whatever is close is easy, whatever is far away is difficult. If you think about this stability estimate I showed you previously, it did not talk about where you actually look for the information. It just tells us that there's a double logarithmic instability if you look for the connectivity as a whole everywhere. So this is somehow a worst case scenario in a way. So I think it would be useful, and we're working in that direction also, to find some depth-dependent stability estimates. To say with recurring edges, parts of let's say similarities that are close to the boundary, you can possibly do that much more stable than whatever is far away from the boundary. This is the clear intuition here. So here's some partial data and the prior information. So the partial data is a lot more difficult than the full data problem, and therefore one should somehow feed more information to the problem in order to get nice reconstructions. So there's a little sequence of pictures here. So this is what we get from the kite phantom if we measure only on this part of the boundary, and there's no prior to the left. In the middle one here, there is a 10% overestimate of the prior, and we get more or less as good as with the full data in this situation. Okay, so even with partial data, knowing where the connectivity is very valuable. So then there's a picture here where we again make the support at the boundary smaller, and there's no prior in this picture. So of course we should compare this one and that one, and we can see there's something, but not somehow get any very much information. Whereas if we go to the where we have the 10% overestimate of the prior, this is what we obtain. So I'm already at the conclusion, so I think that leaves probably normal calibration. But anyway, so the conclusion from this here is that this optimization approach, it allows for a very flexible scheme to incorporate prior information and also think about the parser data problem. So that's extremely nice, but it's very hard to say if this is a convergent algorithm. Say if noise, you put noise to the problem, but if noise level goes to 0, will it then converge to something which is correct? So doing the theory for this kind of optimization problems, which are nonlinear and so on, is pretty hard. So somehow the grand vision behind all this here, what I would like eventually to do, and this is more or less an open problem, is to how can one, I didn't go back to Calderon's first paper, do stable reconstruction for the parser data problem. And there should be possibilities to use CGO solutions to actually do it in a, let's say, a rigorous, mathematically correct way, which this is not really, you don't really know what you get pretty pictures, but what's really coming out is it's hard to tell. So this is something that could be quite nice. And of course, it needs some understanding of what prior information can you feed to the problem. One has to feed a lot of prior information. That's one thing. The other thing is that some better understanding on reconstructing features that are close to the boundary where you measure. If one could do that, that would be excellent as well. So this is the next one. More or less understand the depth dependency in particular for the parser data case. So I guess that was the end of this. So Benji said that no one would complain if I stopped a little bit earlier. So I mean, if you complain, we can come up here. I think we can talk. So I can answer questions. But thank you for the opportunity once again to give some lectures here. I enjoyed it very much. So. Yes.
As you know that at many places where finite element method or trigonometric system has been used in the direct problem, people are using it and successfully there. What about this situation? Is sparsity by orthonormal elimination? Is it possible to take the machine wave? There are hundreds of ways. Someone is doing.
So definitely, that's a very good suggestion. Also, there you could take something that is maybe not completely supported, but you could find this.
Yeah. So the related question is that sparsity regularization. You were talking of the L1 norm.
Yes.
And Candice, Samuel Candice.
Yes.
Compression sensing, there is a field, good field.
Right.
Is it related to somehow that could be related this thing?
Right. I'm not the one to ask about the
but they're also taking the L1 norm minimization.
Right. Yes. I think so. Some of there are some papers I'm aware of where compressed sensing ideas has been used on tried to be used on tomographic problems, but there is a condition for the compressed sensing that is not satisfied for these matrices that enters. For that reason, I'm not sure the theory is so well established. But there are attempts to go in that direction, certainly. But about the other question about using wavelet as a basis, there are papers around, at least one paper, not for EIT, but for regular tomography. I think it's for limited angle tomography problem, where they use how wavelets. So they do the representation there and then they penalize the
your results are available at your website. The results which you have discussed here.
If they are the website?
Yeah.
So my website is very poor. I'm sorry. So this here we will upload with Winky to the course page.
All right. Because that is quite interesting for us.
Yeah. So I already should have mentioned earlier on that I apologize for not putting more references in here. So I would have liked if this was all my work, of course. Everything, but it's far from. So many of the conversations are done by students. That one thing, but the ideas behind are. I know in the literature. So all this algorithm I was explaining today is well understood in the literature. And we took that and used that for the particular problem. So I should maybe give more. Maybe I can put some references before I send it to you. To do that. Yeah.
Just a comment about, since he asked about wavelets, I think there are a series of papers, at least in the 2000s, with people applying it to various inverse problems like optical, thermal imaging kind of thing. So there are a bunch of nonlinear inverse problems which have been solved using wavelets as a basis.
No, but about this.
EIT, I am not aware, but not in EIT.
I know, I am familiar with those.
With those there are.
We are working.
So just how well are wavelets suited to solving elliptic forward problems? Like I'm just I don't work in numerical problems.
No.
So like now the theory for that, right? You have to build finite element methods. You have to match the edges, and like so that they are in H1 and stuff.
Yes.
So can you?
Very well. Yeah, they are very well behaved. Superior to them, but not very superior.
No. What I mean is, but they have to match on the elements and stuff. So can that be done for wavelets?
So I'm not the one to ask about that. So someone else in the audience could add to that. Yeah. Yes.
And there are a lot of papers that has.
But of course,
Arban has published a book on that.
Using wavelets for solving PDEs. Yes. Yes. But of course, the film basis is very handy here. So if it's already represented from the software, it can be fed to the optimization and so on. So it comes in.
Any more questions? If not, let's thank the speaker. And, on behalf of TIFR Camp, we don't need Calron to see what's inside.
That's true.
The next lecture, 3:15. Next lecture is at 3:15. 1:5.